The sailors, they throw him overboard, Kirsplash, and immediately it is silent. It's calm. Nothing. This is the part of the movie where you're like, we're only 15 minutes in. How can the hero die? But he sinks and sinks and sinks. It's the end of the story. But God provided. Spoiler alert, that's the only verse we're going to get to today. Pastor Jess gets the poetry part. But God provided. At some point, Jonah feels the current. I'm sure his eyes are closed. I'm sure he's holding his breath. Your body just kind of innately takes over. And the current pulls him in a different direction. And all of a sudden, you feel a pocket of air, but I am not on the surface, and I can feel these things around me. It feels scratchy, and maybe there's a pocket of air. So we open our eyes a little bit, and we take a deep breath, right? Because we've been holding our breath. And oh my word, does it stink. It's gotta stink. It's gotta be gross, right? We're in the belly of what? Where am I, and how am I not dead? That's gotta be what he's thinking. How did I get here, and how am I not dead? But God provided. I know we all have stories of that space, and we go, well, how do I know if I am in the belly of the fish? Well, I have 3 words for you. Is it icky? Is it sticky? And does it smell? I think a lot of us on this side of heaven experience the icky, the sticky, and the smelly. And we question ourselves because that's what God provided, but God provided, right? And so we're going to ask a couple questions today, and we're going to try to answer a few about that amazing grace of but God provided. I don't know, let's go back a little bit. I know that we talked a little bit about how Jonah ran away from the call of God to go to Nineveh. And that is a big story. That's a big ask, right? The Ninevites are not fun. They're not nice. And so even going to Nineveh could be death. They might not like him. They might run him out. They might kill him. They might do something. So he runs some more. And so the next option is a boat. And that also looks like a storm. And the storms of our lives also look like death or the end or running away. But I think oftentimes we don't always run from God's call or we question what God's call is. I think sometimes it says that he ran from God's presence. And I don't know that we do this intentionally all the time, but I think that we often stop seeking God's presence or we get busy. Sometimes. And so sometimes in our storms, when life gets hectic, when life gets crisis, we don't distinguish the difference between the storm and the icky, sticky, and smelly of what God provided. Because sometimes I think we get them intermixed or mixed up. And so I have a personal story, and I went back and forth about telling this story today. And I promised myself I wouldn't cry, and that's not going to happen, but whatever, we'll get there. So you all know that I've loved Jesus since I was 5, and everything was great. I went to a Bible college, all the things, right? Well, I landed out of college in a really lost place. I didn't know what I wanted to do when I grew up. I thought I was called into ministry. I didn't know what that looked like. It was about 9 months after 9/11, so our economy and jobs were a little weird and different, and I had a business degree, which meant I had the jack of all trades and the master of none, and I was a little lost. And so I had worked a lot of hospitality. I worked a lot of customer service. I enjoyed those jobs. And so I just kind of continued in that path. But it wasn't that landing a great job, great paying job, career kind of a thing. And I still believed in God. I still loved God. I kind of went to church occasionally. The part of the story I don't share often is the part where I had a lot of debt. A lot of debt. I was able to my parents helped what they could. I worked a lot in college, but I was able to put tuition on a credit card, which I don't think you can do that anymore, and I do not suggest that to anybody. And so I came out of school with a lot of debt. And it got worse and worse and worse. And the more I would work, I got myself to a place in my life where I would work and I would sleep, and occasionally go to church. I think that's how we get away from the presence of God, is we fill our lives with the things that are so right here, right now, right focused, that we get into chaos. And I literally got 2 jobs, and I worked, and I worked, and I worked, and I still had a lot of debt. And then I met this guy who was kind of cute, and I'm like, I don't want to tell him about all of this, right? You don't want to tell people about those things. And so I remember the day, we're talking a lot of credit card debt. We're talking it was bad. But I worked. I did the American thing. I had a great work ethic. I worked 2 jobs, all this stuff. I remember calling my parents going, I don't know what to do next. The car I'm driving, I loved that car, but every time it rained, there would be about 2 inches of water in the bottom of it. I clearly could not barely pay my bills, much less be buying a new vehicle or a different vehicle to me. And so God provided. I'm sorry. It's a little. God provided. But God provided came in the icky and the sticky and the smelly of telling my parents how terrible and how awful where I was at. And not only did they help me get a different vehicle, a new to me vehicle, but they also sat me down and said, okay, what is it? And so my mother's an accountant. This is what's so ironic about all of this. I can balance a checkbook and reconcile it to the penny, but I couldn't pay my bills. But we sat down and we made a plan. The icky and the sticky and the smelly is those moments of reconciliation with people and with God. And so we made a plan, and we stuck to it. And at the time, this cute boy became my boyfriend, and his family helped me out. They even offered to let me live there rent-free, which helped my budget, obviously. And I kept working. And then but God provided was a church family. At that time, Kay was coming to church here. And so we started coming. Even when Jeff was off overseas, I would come to church with her. And you guys are my but God provided during that time. It wasn't until those moments of those icky and sticky and smelly and that work that you don't know what end is up or what end is out. Because we got to remind ourselves that Jonah, like us, is in a fish. There's only 2 ways out, and neither one of them look good, do they, at this point? I was recently telling a new grandma that one of the superpowers of parenthood is that ability to catch the throw up as it comes out that I did not have, 13 years ago? I mean, that's something that you get during that time. That's just extra. I don't think we need this. Okay, let's get back in. But God provided. I'm sure we all have those moments of crisis. It might not be monster-mental, and it could be. You could have that amazing testimony of addiction, or that secret, or gambling, or like me, a lot of debt. Or it could be something simple, like I just don't have a way. I haven't heard from God. God doesn't talk to me. Yes, he does. God talks to every one of us. And so I encourage us to really look at where in our lives we can say, but God provided. And recognize when it is a stinky fish. And oftentimes, I think when we look at the stinky fish, we go, really, God? This is what you had in mind? I found it interesting this week as I've been studying the stinky fish. I think it's stinky. I don't know, the fish that I catch are usually stinky, right? Jesus references the fish, as a sea monster. I apologize, we're going to do a little Hebrew lesson. I haven't taken Hebrew, I've been taking Greek, but I've learned how to look up the words, at least. And so, the word in Jonah is actually called a dag. Dag. Everybody say dag. Dag. Dag means a huge fish. And that is, I think, for the original audience, is a really unique word, because God created in the first chapter, when Jonah says, I worship the God that created the sea creatures, in that portion of it, it's a sea monster. It's a tannin. Everybody say tannin. Tannin, a sea monster. The sea was the unknown to the Hebrew people, the Israelites. It was chaos. It meant darkness. It meant unknown. It meant death. And I would imagine that Jonah might not even know where he is. I was thinking about that. Like, he did not have an Encyclopedia Britannica to look up. Like, we know how big fish are. We know how big whales are. We know how big squid are. Would he even know where he was? All of the authors of the Bible, like in Genesis, God created the sea monsters. Even Jesus refers to it as a sea monster. And here in Jonah, it's called a dag, which is a huge fish. So for us, what we see as a sea monster, what we see as the icky and the sticky and the smelly, God sees as a fish. I think God sees it a lot like that book that we read, kind of as a goldfish. But God provided a fish. In the early Christian tradition in the new church, it was a lot of the Christians had to be undercover because it was dangerous. And so a lot of times they would draw a symbol in the sand or put a symbol up. Do you guys remember what that symbol was? It was a fish. And it's a fish because the consonant letters I'm going to get the language wrong. I think it's in Aramaic, mean fish. So it represented, who did it represent? Jesus. So is Jesus our fish? I think so. I think that, but God provides a huge fish. Okay, so what happens when we're in the icky and the sticky and the smelly? I'm here. I recognize that I've through my crisis. I recognize that for whatever reason, I've either surrendered or I haven't surrendered. By the way, we're not going to really talk a whole lot about Jonah in this situation because there's a lot of debate as to whether Jonah is somebody we should model or not model in this particular passage. And we'll leave those questions for when we get there. But I think Jonah does a good job here of giving us a couple ideas of what to do when we find ourselves in the icky and sticky. A couple, not all of them. But we're going to go to a couple other places in the Bible as well. Let me get on this page. I think the first place that we find ourselves when we find ourselves in the icky and the sticky is to recognize that we need to stop running. Stop running from the presence of God. At some point in my mess of my 20s, I had to call my parents. I had to tell Jeff. I had to say, hey, this is not good. We have to stop running. And guess what? We have to stop running from God because we're not good at it. We are not good at running from God. Even Jonah, who's running from God, right? Jonah's running to Nineveh. He running away from Nineveh. He gets on the boat. He does the things. He gets thrown overboard. And yet still, God finds him. He says it right here. I called to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me out of the belly of Sheol. He's quoting Psalms, but that reminds me of the psalm that we kind of read this morning for our call to worship. And so I wanted to read a few more pages of that verses of Psalm 139. It's the inescapable God. O Lord, you have searched me and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise. You discern my thoughts from far away. You have searched out my path and my lying down. Even before a word was on my tongue, O Lord, you know it completely. You hemmed me in and behind and before, and lay your hand upon me. Such knowledge is too wonderful for me, it cannot hide. Oh, where can I go from your spirit? For you are there. If I send to heaven, you are there, and if I go to Sheol, you are there. When we find ourselves in the belly of the fish, we have to stop running because we cannot hide from God. He knows it all. He knows where we are. He knows what's on our hearts. He knew it before we got here, and he knows how we're getting out of the fish. Even if it's one way or the other, he knows. When Zachary was about 3, Jeff and I were living in Milwaukee, and we'd continued on this path of living and getting started in life. And we had to sit down about our finances, as all married couples should do. And we made a conscious choice at that moment in our lives to start giving and doing our tithe. Now, remind you, I have been a Christian since I was 5, and it had never been one of those spiritual practices that I was very consistent at. And that's one of those spiritual habits that part of our testimony is to say that could be one of those moments where I can say, God pulled us out of a belly of a fish. It still hasn't been easy. It still isn't always easy. It's not like we won the lottery the next week and are now millionaires, because there's so much more to it than pulling yourself out of that debt or trying to. I can't do that all on my own. Jonah can't get out of the fish on his own. But it's one of those spiritual habits that we can say is part of our testimony. And it doesn't always come with the hard work and the dedication and things like that. It also comes with the pursuing God's presence. It comes with the recognizing that there are 6 days to work, and the 7th God created. It comes with the working hard, yes, but it also comes with practicing contentment and having open communication with your partner and talking about once the bills are all paid, what you get to do with the rest of it. Once you've given and then the bills. That is part of our story of being in the icky and the sticky and the smelly. Okay, so this is the best part of the story, though. How long do we have to stay in the icky and the sticky and the smelly? It's 3 days. What does God do with our 3 days? So what does 3 days remind us of? This should be an easy one. Easter. Yes. Easter. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. It reminds us of Easter, and it should. It's supposed to remind us of Easter, of Jesus. He even says it when Jesus summarizes his whole time on earth and his whole purpose in earth. He says it there in Luke. For I will die, and 3 days later I will rise again. But that's not the only place that it is in Scripture. 3 days is also, on the third day is the day that God created land. The very thing that humans needed to survive, because we don't survive well in the ocean, do we, or the lake, unless we're going to all live in fish. And the last I checked, that's not a great place to live. And then on the 6th day, it says that that's the day he created humans and animals. So 3 days and 3 days. A 3-day journey is what Abraham and Isaac took when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. And that story actually is a really great story because guess what? Isaac and him are walking along, and it's 3 days up to the Mount Moriah. And Isaac goes, Dad, I don't see, what are we sacrificing? I don't understand what we're sacrificing. And all Abraham can tell him is, but God will provide. But God will provide. David has the same situation when he is hiding in a cave from Saul, wondering, fighting for his life. And Jonathan says, hey, my dad is going to kill you. And so he sits in the cave for 3 days. When we sit in the belly of the fish or the cave, and we recognize that but God will provide, we also recognize that we are not coming out the same as we went in. It's a representation of surrender. It's a representation of death to our old self. It's a representation to sacrifice. And it's a testimony to that grace that Zach played. And it's a testimony to the divine power of God in resurrection. The 3-day journey that we all get to take doesn't always look the same. Our 3-day journey does not look like Jesus' 3-day journey. Does not look like Abraham's 3-day journey. But we all have a 3-day journey when we're called by God. On the 3rd day, he rose again. The 3rd day also represents the divine provision, intervention, and redemption. So, like we've talked in the past, all of Jonah ends in a question. So our first week was, why do we run from the presence of God? Our second week was, is it good news that the sailors get to be part of our story? And today, my question for you is really simple. So I think we also can grow in our faith really well when we tell our but God provided stories. And what does God do with your 3 days in the icky